Hey guys, today I'm gonna be giving you my first impressions on the game Plague Inc. Evolve. There's a bit of background about myself. I have a doctorate in pharmacy and a master's of business administration in pharmaceutical management. Now, I've worked in hospitals, community pharmacies, I've done some bench lab research, and I'm currently working for a large pharmaceutical company that's based on the East Coast. At my current company, I've worked in global marketing, particularly for neuroscience products, and currently I'm working in US marketing with digital therapeutics. Now, I do not claim to be an expert in infectious disease, which is what this game is primarily based about, but hopefully I can share my experiences having worked with people who are, and combine that with my love of playing video games, and kind of talk a little bit about the game's mechanics and the strategy and maybe how realistic it is and how that aligns with what we're doing in real life. So I've gotten a chance to play a few rounds already and log in a couple of hours of gameplay, but I failed miserably in those few rounds, but I think I learned enough to share some of my initial impressions. So the game starts you off having to select a country where you can have patient zero, or the first patient that's going to be infected. And my thoughts are that this is a pretty critical decision because different countries have very different healthcare systems and patient access to healthcare. So take like Canada and the UK for example, where there's universal healthcare. So these countries might be a little bit harder to get the infection to ramp because it is easier for patients to have that access versus countries that either have a self-pay system or maybe a country like the US where healthcare may be a little bit more difficult or more expensive. Third world countries are probably also going to have very limited access to healthcare. So when I think about where I would think a infection would likely spread the quickest, you certainly have to take those things into consideration. And then naturally, you want to think about how densely populated the areas are. And I think a lot of people think about China and how densely populated they are, and considering what's going on in the news lately with the Wuhan novel coronavirus, I think this is, probably a appropriate time to kind of talk about this game and what's going on in the news recently. So I think that the game does an excellent job of factoring those things in. So depending on which country it is, the access to healthcare, the amount of medication that will be available, the difficulty to ramp up the infection in those countries, the game has factored those things into consideration. So it makes it a little bit more realistic. I decided to start off with Canada because having played this game, I think because of the combination of the cold weather and the fact that Canada has very good access to healthcare, I've had difficulty getting the bacterial infection to spread and infect this country. Another thing that's natural for me and a very pressing issue for those who do work in hospitals or in the pharmaceutical industry has been the rise of antibacterial resistance, which has caused the emergence of what we call superbugs. And the problem with prescribing or taking an overabundance of antibiotics is that now you're left with a subpopulation of bacteria that has evolved and adapted and become highly resistant to the current treatments we have available now. So there's been a lot of growing interest in learning about things like predictive analytics and using artificial intelligence or AI to predict different resistance patterns and determine what's the best course of antibiotics for patients in order to reduce that risk. And this is based on big data collected from thousands of patients from different healthcare systems throughout different geographic areas and electronic healthcare records. This playthrough right now is primarily centered around a novel bacterial infection, but there's a big difference between viral and bacterial. I know this game has other scenarios in other playthroughs where you can evolve a viral or fungal infection. And the reason I bring this up is because just based on history, take for example HIV, which still has no cure, although there's still many new treatments that's being researched, and current treatment options can suppress your viral load to very low, undetectable level to help control the spread of the virus as well. But the first documented case was in 1959, and we're still working on that. Although a lot of pharmaceutical companies are developing long-acting and implantable therapies, so there's a lot of research going on, a lot to be hopeful for. Another example is the influenza virus, which is another virus that every year we don't have a cure for. We develop vaccines, but unfortunately is really just a best guess case scenario every year. We try to guess what the most prevalent strains are on that year based on previous years, and some years we really just whiff on what we think it's going to be. I think it was last year or the year before we really did a bad job in developing a vaccine, and I think we really fell short on protecting people against the flu virus. And in general, drug development process or vaccine development process, sometimes can take around a decade and cost billions of dollars for a new drug or vaccine to go from discovery to approval. And a lot of that stuff is just because the science isn't there yet. And certainly in certain medical emergencies, such as the one that this game is trying to emulate, I think those things can certainly be expedited, right? So those things change depending on what the circumstances are. And another example I will probably provide is the Ebola virus. Now, Ebola virus recently has had vaccines go through development and approval and priority reviews from different regulatory agencies, but it's been around for a while. I think just more recently has the outbreak has been a little bit more pressing. So that's an example of how like pharmaceutical companies with governments have kind of changed their priorities in developing cures or vaccines for new epidemics. Anyway, so back to the game. In terms of what you spend your DNA points on or the evolution of the infection, it really makes sense to ramp up the transmission first to get as many people infected as possible with as little symptoms so that it can go undetected. And I think the game does a great job of recognizing that once a disease becomes lethal and people start dying, that's when the CDC and the World Health Organization is really going to start stepping up and recognizing that it's a serious pandemic, declare it as a crisis of international urgency. So what you want to do is try to make the symptoms as mild as possible. Things like cough and rashes are pretty ubiquitous for much more milder conditions like the common cold, so many providers will more likely than not diagnose patients with something much more common rather than start thinking that it could be something rare or more serious. In the medical community, they're just saying though that it's along the lines of when you hear hooves, you think zebras, but more often than not, they're horses. And just to kind of relate it back to what's going on today, the CDC and the World Health Organization have yet to declare that the 2020 Wuhan novel coronavirus has yet to be declared as a outbreak or a public health emergency of international concern. And today, during the recording of this video, there have been 55 deaths and likely thousands of people who are already infected, who may not be displaying the symptoms. what I don't like about the media is obviously the attention that's around this novel new virus, but that's usually how the news media works, right? When there's something new and exciting, that's where the coverage is, and that's what generates a lot of the fear. But the example I want to bring up is the comparison with the flu. Just comparing the numbers, flu has caused over 50,000 deaths last year and affected tens of millions of people. But there isn't as much coverage or recognition over this issue because it's not something that's new, it's something that's been around for a while. And in terms of lethality, right now the Wuhan virus I think has a lethal rate of 3%. So those are just some numbers that I kind of compared it to, but I digress. So now I'm going to primarily do upgrades on transmission effectivity because I think once you get every country infected, what we want to do is increase the antimicrobial resistance and delay the medical research to develop a cure. And then I think the end game strategy is to make the infection as severe and lethal as possible toward the end. I think that's a general strategy for this game. In terms of upgrading the symptoms, I think anything that causes sepsis in a patient, which is the body's immune response to when the infection infects the bloodstream and causes a host of cascade effects and inflammation that ultimately leads to multi-organ failure and ultimately death, is the worst thing that can happen. So in this game, I think that accurately reflects that. In the skill tree, you can see that the multi-organ failure sort of research is the one that is most lethal and severe, I think. It branches down from the different lung abnormalities or conditions, which also makes sense because some antibiotics like daptomycin gets inactivated by lung surfactants. The thing with this game, it doesn't focus too much on the medical treatment side of it. You just know that the different world powers or countries are working on a cure, and you just research the technology or the upgrades to slow that progression. So it doesn't focus too much on how the symptoms are treated or how the cure is being developed. They just know that it's coming, and you can either just slow it down or let it speed up. So in that aspect of the game, there's not too much detail. So that could be perceived as a downside of the game if that's something that you kind of wish you wanted to have a little bit more in-depth understanding of or playthrough. Otherwise, I found the game to be pretty simple, simplistic enough for it to be fun, and it's the ramp up for learning this game is pretty low. So I think for any casual gamer like myself, it's pretty easy to pick up. It's not too complicated. There's still various scenarios and different types of infections like the viral and fungal and parasitic that I've yet to play through. So these are just my initial impressions of the game, which I find very entertaining. And I think a lot of aspects of it is more or less tries to simulate real life scenarios. I personally really like these type of games. So that's it, guys, for my review and my perspective, having some experience, having worked in the medical industry, both on the field, in the community and hospital, as well as on the pharmaceutical industry side. I'm a relatively new YouTuber, and so I'm really curious what you guys think of this review and what type of videos you would like to see in the future. I've posted some game reviews, also some speedruns of things I've done before. Maybe you guys could subscribe or leave a comment. Just kind of any general feedback you can give about my videos or any recommendations about anything I can do. It would really be greatly appreciated. So Thank you guys for watching, and hopefully see you guys next time.